I remember that day vividly. It was so unexpected yet so exciting. It all started one night as the house felt quiet. It wasn't the typical quiet. It felt different, unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I sat at the kitchen table, idly tapping my fingers on its surface, staring at a half-empty glass of water in front of me. My son Alex would be home any minute now. He'd been gone for the weekend with some friends, and while I was used to his absence, something about this time felt different. He was 24 now, not the boy I used to run after in the yard or the teenager I used to help fix his bike. He had grown into a man in what felt like the blink of an eye, confident, independent, and yet sometimes distant in a way that made me feel like I didn't know him anymore. I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open, followed by the soft thud of his bag hitting the floor. There was a pause before he spoke, his voice echoing through the hallway. "Dad, you home?" "Yeah," I called back, trying to sound casual, as if I hadn't been waiting for him. In the kitchen, moments later he appeared in the doorway, a faint smile tugging at his lips. His eyes, though, told a different story, something lingering beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite read. "How was the trip?" I asked, getting up to grab another glass from the cabinet. "Good," he replied, shrugging. "It's good to be home, though." There was something about the way he said home that made me pause. I handed him the glass and watched as he took a sip, his gaze flickering to me before looking away. The tension in the air was palpable, though neither of us acknowledged it. "We could watch a movie or something," he suggested, and for a moment I considered saying no, but then I thought better of it. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "What are you in the mood for?" He smiled faintly, that same boyish grin I remember from years ago. But as we walked into the living room, it hit me again. He wasn't that boy anymore. His presence filled the room in a way that unsettled me, a reminder of how much time had passed and how things between us had shifted without me even realizing it. We settled onto the couch, and I noticed for the first time how much taller he was than me now, how his broad shoulders seemed to take up more space. He stretched his arms over the back of the couch, his hand resting just inches away from my shoulder. The TV flickered to life, but I barely noticed what was on the screen. My attention was elsewhere, on the way he moved, the subtle shift in the air whenever he leaned closer, and the way his knee brushed against mine when he adjusted his position. It wasn't intentional, just an innocent touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine nonetheless. I shifted slightly, hoping he wouldn't notice, but then he looked over at me. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost concerned. "Yeah, fine," I replied quickly. Too quickly. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to the screen, but I could tell something was on his mind, and maybe that was the real problem. There had been too many unspoken things between us lately. Too many moments where I felt like I should say something but didn't know what to say, and now here we were side by side, both pretending everything was normal when it was anything but. The movie played on, but neither of us was paying attention. My mind raced, replaying the small moments that had led to this, his sudden distance over the last few months, the way he looked at me sometimes, like there was something he wasn't saying. And now, sitting so close, the tension between us felt almost suffocating. Alex shifted again, his leg pressing lightly against mine. It could have been accidental, but the way his breath hitched for just a second told me otherwise. I should have moved. I should have said something. But instead I stayed still, pretending I didn't feel the way my heart started to race in my chest. "Dad?" His voice was barely above a whisper, and when I looked at him, the expression on his face made my stomach flip. He was nervous, unsure, maybe even scared. But why? I swallowed hard, trying to push down the knot of confusion building inside me. "What is it, Alex?" There was a long pause, his eyes searching mine for something. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, he seemed to think better of it, shaking his head slightly. "Nothing," he said, his voice tight. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it. Whatever he was holding back, whatever had been left unsaid between us, it was growing, pushing against the boundaries of our relationship in ways I didn't fully understand. We both turned back to the movie, but the silence that settled between us wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, thick with the weight of everything we weren't saying. And I knew, even without him saying a word, that something had changed between us tonight, something that couldn't be ignored much longer. The next morning the sunlight crept through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the living room. I hadn't slept well. The tension from the night before had settled deep into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened between Alex and me. He had gone to bed without saying much, and now, as I sat at the breakfast table sipping my coffee, the silence of the house felt louder than ever. The smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen usually brought a sense of comfort, but not today. Today it felt like the calm before something inevitable. I heard the faint sound of footsteps from the hallway, and my heart picked up its pace. Alex entered the room, rubbing the back of his neck and yawning. "Morning," he said casually, though there was a slight edge to his voice. "Morning," I replied, offering a weak smile. The words felt hollow, like we were both going through the motions of normalcy, when things between us were anything but. He grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down across from me, his eyes flickering toward the window. For a moment we sat there in awkward silence, the only sound the occasional clink of his spoon against the mug. I could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between us, and it was suffocating. I was thinking of heading out for a bit later. Alex said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "Clear my head." I nodded, not sure how to respond. Part of me was relieved that he wanted some space, but another part, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, felt a pang of disappointment. It was strange. Just yesterday, I would have welcomed the idea of having the house to myself, but now I wasn't so sure. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just to the park, maybe." "I need to think." His words were clipped, as if he was holding something back. "All right," I said, taking a sip of my coffee to avoid meeting his eyes. There was a heaviness in the air that neither of us could ignore, but neither of us knew how to address it either. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be back later." With that, he left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hallway before the front door closed behind him. The house felt impossibly quiet once he was gone, and I found myself staring into my coffee cup, lost in thought. This wasn't the first time Alex had been distant, but it was the first time it felt like there was something more beneath the surface, something unspoken. I didn't know if I wanted to dig deeper, but I had a feeling that whatever it wasn't going to go away on its own. The day dragged on, the hours slipping by in a blur of silence. I busied myself with chores, hoping the mindless tasks would distract me from the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. But no matter how much I cleaned or how many times I checked my phone, my thoughts kept drifting back to Alex. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it. Maybe we were just going through one of those awkward phases parents and their adult children sometimes go through. Maybe the tension was all in my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something real between us, something that neither of us had the courage to confront. By the time Alex returned, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the living room. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book without really reading it when I heard the door open. He walked in quietly, his expression guarded as if he wasn't sure what to say. "Hey," I said softly, closing the book and setting it aside. "Hey," he replied, his voice just as soft. There was a pause, a long one, and I could see the gears turning in his head like he was trying to decide whether or not to say something. "I've been thinking," he finally said, sitting down on the edge of the couch, though he kept a bit of distance between us. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at the floor for a moment, running his hand through his hair in that way he always did when he was nervous. "About us, about how things have been different." My heart skipped a beat. There it was, the thing we had both been avoiding. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I've noticed it too." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Vulnerability, fear, maybe even hope. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But lately I've been feeling, I don't know, confused, I guess. I nodded slowly, trying to process what he was saying. The knot in my chest tightened, and I could feel my pulse quicken. It's okay to be confused, Alex, I said, though the words felt inadequate. We all go through it. Yeah, but this is different, he said, his voice growing more intense. I've never felt this way before, not about anyone. My breath caught in my throat. There was an unspoken implication in his words, something that made my stomach churn with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Alex looked away, his hands gripping his knees tightly. I don't know how to deal with this, Dad. I don't know what's happening to me. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the less I understood. What was he trying to tell me? And why did it feel like I already knew the answer, even though I didn't want to admit it? Alex, I said softly, reaching out to touch his arm, but he flinched at the contact, pulling away slightly. The rejection stung, though I tried not to show it. Don't, he said, his voice trembling. I can't. I don't know how to do this. I pulled my hand back, my heart aching with the weight of his words. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, I said gently. We can talk about it when you're ready. He shook his head, frustration clear in his expression. That's the thing. I don't think I'll ever be ready, and I don't even know what this is. He trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. I watched him, feeling helpless. This wasn't something I could fix with a few comforting words or a fatherly pat on the back. Whatever Alex was going through, it was deeper than that, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know how to help him. Maybe it's just a phase, I offered, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't the right thing to say. People go through phases. Maybe, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But what if it's not? I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that the dynamic between us had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The thought terrified me. What if this new distance between us never closed? What if we were stuck in this limbo forever, with neither of us brave enough to address the growing chasm? After a long moment, Alex stood up, pacing the room. I think I just need some time, he said, his voice low. I need to figure things out. I nodded, though I could feel the lump forming in my throat. Take all the time you need, I said, even though I wasn't sure if I meant it. I'm here when you're ready. He gave me a small, grateful smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Thanks, Dad. As he walked toward his room, I sat back on the couch, staring at the now-dark TV screen. The silence in the house returned, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with all the things neither of us knew how to say. It was late when I heard the soft knock on my bedroom door. I'd been lying in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions and confusion. Alex hadn't spoken much after our conversation earlier, retreating to his room, leaving the house steeped in a silence that felt even heavier than before. I wasn't sure what to expect when the knock came. Part of me hoped he just wanted to say goodnight, maybe even offer a small gesture that things between us were still okay. But another part, the part I'd been trying to ignore, feared that whatever was about to happen would push us further into uncharted territory. Come in, I said, my voice barely audible in the quiet of the house. The door creaked open slowly and Alex stepped inside, his face shadowed in the dim light from the hallway. He stood there for a moment, hesitating as if he wasn't sure whether or not he should enter. I sat up, pulling the covers a bit tighter around me, feeling the unease settle deeper in my chest. Can we talk? He asked, his voice soft and uncertain. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what there was left to say. We had already danced around so many unspoken truths that it felt like we were circling the same unresolved tension, and yet here he was standing in the doorway, looking at me in a way that made my heart race for reasons I couldn't quite explain. He took a few steps forward and sat down on the edge of the bed, keeping some distance between us, though the tension in the room was palpable. I've been thinking a lot, he began, his eyes fixed on the floor, about what we talked about earlier, about everything really. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening, and I'm not sure how to say this, but I feel like I've been fighting something for a long time, something I don't understand and I don't know what to do with it. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of his words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. "What are you trying to say, Alex?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. The truth had been creeping up on me for days, weeks even, but I hadn't been ready to face it. Not until now. He looked up then, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "but I can't stop thinking about us, about this connection we have." The air seemed to leave the room all at once, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I'd heard him correctly. The words hung in the space between us, too heavy to ignore, too dangerous to fully acknowledge. "Alex," I began, my voice barely steady. "We're father and son. Whatever this is, it's confusing. It's not something we can—" "I know that," he interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, though his eyes were filled with desperation. "I know we're not supposed to feel like this, but I do. I can't help it, Dad. I've tried, but I don't know what to do anymore." I could feel the weight of his confession settling over me like a thick fog, clouding my thoughts, my ability to think clearly. This wasn't something I'd ever imagined dealing with. The boundaries that had once been so clear between us were now blurred, and I didn't know how to fix it. He shifted closer on the bed, and though the distance between us was small, it felt monumental. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I couldn't answer right away. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the air between us felt charged with something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to name. "Alex, But before I could finish, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a way that was both tentative and deliberate. It wasn't much, just a simple touch, but it was enough to send a jolt of something electric through me, something I wasn't supposed to feel. "I know this is wrong," he whispered, his eyes never leaving mine, "but I can't stop it, and I think maybe you feel the same way." For a moment, I was frozen, torn between every instinct telling me to pull away and the undeniable pull that kept me rooted to the spot. I should have stopped it. I should have told him to leave, to walk away before things went any further, but I couldn't, and I hated myself for it. Instead, I stayed still as his hand lingered on mine, the warmth of his skin seeping into me in a way that made my head spin. My throat felt tight, and the words I knew I should say, words that would put an end to this, refused to come. "I don't know what to do, Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "But I know I can't keep pretending everything's normal, not when I feel like this." My mind was racing, trying to find a way out of this moment, out of this tangled mess we had found ourselves in. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no simple way out. We had already crossed too many lines, and now we were standing on the edge of something I didn't know how to navigate. "Alex," I said finally, my voice trembling, "we can't do this. We can't feel like this." He nodded slowly, though the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "I know," he whispered, "but that doesn't change the fact that I do." For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on us. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. "I think I should go," Alex said finally, his voice strained, before something happens. I nodded, relief and regret swirling inside me in equal measure. "Yeah," I whispered, "maybe that's for the best." He stood up slowly, his movements hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether or not he actually wanted to leave. But after a moment he turned and headed for the door, his hand lingering on the doorknob for just a second before he pulled it open. "Good night, Dad," he said softly, not turning around. "Good night, Alex," I replied, my voice barely audible. And then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the room. The hours that followed were a blur of restless thoughts and emotions I couldn't untangle. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. Every word, every glance, every touch lingered like a weight on my chest, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the feeling wouldn't go away. We had crossed a line tonight, and though nothing had happened, I knew that something had shifted irreversibly between us. The boundaries we had once adhered to so strictly were now blurred, and I didn't know how to go back to the way things were. But as the night wore on and sleep continued to elude me, I realized something terrifying. Deep down, a part of me didn't want to go back, and that scared me more than anything else. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains of the house, bathing everything in a golden light. It was peaceful outside, the kind of quiet that made you want to go out and start fresh, but inside, everything still felt off-kilter. I'd spent the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts of Alex, our conversation, and the kiss that never should have happened. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, its steady rhythm somehow making the silence more oppressive. I kept waiting for Alex to come down, waiting for the moment we'd have to talk about what had happened, but the door to his room remained closed. I couldn't stop replaying it all in my mind, the way he had looked at me, the tension in the room, and then that kiss. So brief, but so electric. It was like we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I didn't know what to do about it. I knew we had to stop, to pull back before things got even more complicated, but the weight of that decision was pressing down on me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Eventually, I heard the soft creak of his bedroom door opening, followed by footsteps down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't ready for this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. We couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine. "Morning," Alex said as he stepped into the kitchen, his voice careful, almost hesitant. He grabbed a mug from the cabinet and poured himself some coffee, avoiding eye contact. "Morning," I replied, my voice tight. The word felt empty, as if it couldn't quite fill the space between us. We both sat there in silence for a few moments, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. I could feel the conversation looming like a storm on the horizon, but neither of us seemed willing to be the one to start it. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to say something, anything, to break the unbearable quiet. "We need to talk," I finally said, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the stillness of the room. Alex glanced at me, his expression guarded. "I know." I set my coffee cup down on the table, folding my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking. "What happened last night? We can't let that happen again." He looked down, his jaw tightening. "I know it was wrong," he said quietly, his fingers drumming nervously against the side of his mug. "But I don't know how to stop feeling like this." I felt a knot tighten in my chest at his words. I had spent the entire night trying to figure out what to say to him, trying to find the right words to put this all behind us, but the truth was, I didn't know how to handle this any better than he did. I was supposed to be the one with the answers, the one who could fix things, but how could I fix something like this? "We have to, Alex," I said, my voice firm but laced with uncertainty. "We can't let these feelings control us." He looked up at me then, and I saw the pain in his eyes. "But what if they already have?" he asked softly. "What if it's too late to go back?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead, hadn't let myself consider the possibility that this might be something we couldn't just move past. But now, looking at him, I realized that maybe I'd been lying to myself. Maybe we had already crossed a line we couldn't retreat from. "We can still fix this," I said, though my voice wavered with doubt. "We can't let it go any further." For a moment, he didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at his coffee as if it held the answers he was searching for. Then, without warning, he pushed his chair back and stood up, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "I can't keep pretending like this isn't happening," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've been trying, Dad. I really have. But every time I'm around you, it just gets worse. I stood up too, suddenly feeling the need to move, to do something other than sit there helplessly. You're confused, Alex, I said, trying to stay calm. This isn't something real, it's just... Don't tell me it's not real, he snapped, cutting me off. His eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and desperation, and for the first time, I could see just how deeply this was affecting him. You felt it too. I know you did. I didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, I had felt it too. The same pull, the same strange connection that seemed to defy everything I thought I knew about us. But I couldn't admit that. Not out loud. Not to him. Alex, we can't do this, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I'm your father. We can't let this happen. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression raw, vulnerable. But what if I can't stop it? What if this is just how I feel, no matter how wrong it is? I shook my head, trying to stay composed. We'll figure it out, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We'll get through this, but we have to be strong. We can't let these feelings destroy us. He took a step closer, his eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the tension between us growing with each passing second. I don't want to lose you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. But I don't know how to stop feeling like this. His words hung in the air, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. And then, before I could say anything, before I could stop it, he stepped forward and kissed me again. This time it wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was urgent, desperate, as if he was trying to pour all of his confusion, his pain, his need into that one kiss. And for a split second, I found myself kissing him back. It was instinctual, a response to the intensity of the moment, and it was over almost as soon as it began. I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Alex, no, I whispered, my voice trembling. We can't. But the damage was already done. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There was no going back now. He took a step back, his expression one of heartbreak and confusion. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. I know, I said, though my voice sounded far away, like it was coming from someone else. But this can't happen again. He nodded, though he looked like he was on the verge of breaking. I'll go, he said quietly. I think I need to get out of here for a while. I nodded, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over me. Maybe that's for the best. Without another word, Alex turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard the front door open and close, and then the silence returned, heavier than ever. I sat back down at the table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of me. My hands were shaking, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that everything had changed. There was no going back to the way things were before. The bond between us had been altered in a way that couldn't be undone, and I wasn't sure if we could ever fix it. I wanted to believe that time would heal this, that we could find a way to move past it. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The kiss, the unspoken feelings, it had all opened a door that could never be closed again. As the minutes turned into hours, I sat there, lost in my thoughts, trying to make sense of the mess we had found ourselves in. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a way out. The line between father and son had blurred, and I didn't know how to fix it. And as much as I wanted to pretend that everything would be okay, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again.